Hello and welcome to the Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. This is an update on what's going on in the Nagorno-Karabakh. We had Dima Babic earlier today, and now we have Professor Paul Robinson in Canada. He is a professor of political science, I'm correct?
Public international affairs, it is.
Public international affairs, and a prolific writer, an awesome commentator. And we have George Szamuely, also co-founder of the Gaggle here. I want to listen to as much to Paul as possible here because I really enjoyed your article that was published recently at RT on this topic here. What is the importance of this story? Why should we be following it? Go ahead.
Well, I mean, there's a very great potential here of all-out war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and that also creates possibilities of conflict between Russia and Turkey, because Armenia is an ally of Russia as a member of the Collective Security Treaty Organization. Should the fighting ever get onto Armenian territory, then Russia would be treaty bound to defend Armenia, whereas Azerbaijan is an ally of Turkey, and Turkey is backing Azeris quite heavily in this conflict. So it's not just a local conflict, there are some geopolitical ramifications here.
Yeah, and Turkey's a member of NATO. We need to remember that as well.
Yeah, that's true too.
Go ahead, George.
Paul, could you elaborate on why exactly is Turkey getting itself so seriously involved in all of this? I mean, I know they're allies and the Turks regard the Azerbaijanis as Turkic peoples, but why is Erdogan going out on a limb here?
Now that's slightly beyond my sphere of competence, and but I'm not a Turkish expert, and I certainly don't know what is going on in his brain. Some people view this in terms of neo-Ottoman imperialism and this idea of sort of unifying all the Turkic peoples, which would stretch therefore from Turkey through Azerbaijan into Turkmenistan. That may be pushing it a little bit too far, I think, but certainly Erdogan has been pushing his weight around quite a lot recently, not just in Azerbaijan, but also, of course, in Libya and in Syria, where he's also bashed up against the Russians. So it seems to fit into a general pattern of assertiveness in Turkish foreign policy.
It's one of those strange things, why does he do it? And oddly enough, the answer is because he can do it. And that seems to put his foreign policy into a nutshell, because, he's facing himself off against the Russians now with Nagorno-Karabakh. We have Libya and we have Syria. And again, I want to stress that's a NATO, Turkey's a member of NATO. Paul, can you give us a little bit of the context here? Why are they arguing about this piece of real estate? Because it is majority populated by Armenians, but it is internationally recognized as being part of Azerbaijan. At the end of the Soviet Union, we had Azerbaijan and Armenia fight over this. Azerbaijan was defeated, and now their mantra is 20% of their territory is under occupation. For me, looking at the Soviet past, is that, you could think of Stalin as the great cartographer, because he got everybody at everybody's throats, and that was no accident. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, you do need to go way back in time to Soviet nationalities policy, which created a sort of patchwork of different levels of autonomy, stretching down from Soviet socialist republics, such as Armenia and Azerbaijan, through what were called autonomous republics, autonomous regions, there were autonomous krais and autonomous oblasts, and a whole bunch of different levels. And when it was kind of arbitrary who got to be a republic and who just got to be an oblast or something, right? It was whatever some Soviet bureaucrat thought you were worth at that time. And sometimes they would stick a minority within another minority to balance it off a little bit. And that was fine as long as everyone was under the Communist Party. But once the Communist Party collapsed, the minorities within the minorities started saying, well, if the bigger minority can have independence, why can't we? And this, in fact, even began before the collapse of the Soviet Union. The conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh was the very first ethnic conflict, really, in the late Soviet Union. It started off a couple of years before the Soviet Union collapsed. There was a big earthquake in that part of the world. And this bit of Armenian-dominated territory within Azerbaijan demanded to be split off and added to Armenia. And obviously the Azeris didn't like that because no one likes to lose territory, right? I mean, you don't. And so they had a war. The Armenians won it, but the Azeris have never accepted the result. And that's really where it is. It's just another one of these frozen post-Soviet conflicts.
So why is it exploded now? Is there anything particular going on now that it suddenly should just flare up?
Not as far as I know. I mean, it has flared up before, off and on. I mean, the only explanation I can think of is perhaps related to perhaps Azerbaijan being pushed a little bit by Erdogan. That may be part of it. Mm-hmm. Also, there is a shift in the balance of power in that the Azeri population has grown very rapidly since the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Armenian population has not. There are now 3 times as many Azeris as the Armenians. Also, the Azeris have oil, so they have money which they can put in weapons. So they may feel that, you know, the balance of power is shifting in their favor and it's time to act. And of course, the Armenians, on the other hand, might be looking at this and going, well, if we're going to have another war, you know, maybe it's better to have it now.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that may encourage them to take a hard line, because if they're going to fight it out, probably better to fight it now than 10 years down the road.
Yeah, and what we've seen here, you're absolutely right, because of the oil wealth, Azerbaijan has been able to pump a lot into its military. But Armenia has done the same, maybe not on the same level, but they've spent quite a bit of money on defense as well, with their eye on the Nagorno-Karabakh and Azerbaijan, which of course is a mixture for disaster, okay? Meanwhile, Moscow is watching all of this, and I'm sure with much chagrin, on how this is going to have to play out, because as you pointed out, that Russia does have certain obligations to Armenia's security, and they don't want to be pulled into a war against Azerbaijan.
And just following up on that, Peter, is that in addition to that, you know, it's one thing Armenia and Azerbaijan fighting. It's quite another thing if Turkey gets involved. If this is so, that Turkey shot down an Armenian aircraft, that's a serious business. That's not something Russia can just simply overlook, you know, and therefore any, get direct military conflict between Armenia and Turkey, Russia will get involved. They're not just going to sit on their hands on that one.
Yes, I think this news you just announced there, Peter, is very disturbing, and there was already talk yesterday that the Armenians were saying something about it. If the F-16s got involved, then they would retaliate with rocket strikes into Azerbaijan. So this is clearly an escalatory act, and it creates a real problem for Russia, because Russia has these obligations, as you say, George, towards Armenia, but it would rather not fulfill them. Right? I mean, it doesn't want a war with Turkey. It certainly doesn't want to have to be sucked into war with Azerbaijan. It has quite decent relations with Azerbaijan. It does a reasonable amount of trade with Azerbaijan. It's not in Russia's interest for this to escalate.
Yeah, but I think, we go back to the wild card and all this and Erdogan here. And I'm just speculating here right now, thinking off the top of my head. But it's probably not it is within reason to think that Erdogan might be able to use this as part of his gambit with facing off the Russians in Syria and in Libya at the same time. Because I do have this feeling that Erdogan likes a grand bargain, okay? And with the situation in Idlib, which is an absolutely losing proposition for Erdogan in Turkey, it's very possible, in my mind, that he might be sending a signal to the Kremlin that they're open to parley. From what I can see, the Russians are exhausted by Erdogan's antics in his part of the world. But I wouldn't dismiss that as a possibility, Paul.
Yeah, it's certainly possible. I mean, he may think he's on top. After all, when General Haftar, who is more or less on terms with the Russians in Libya, advanced on Tripoli, Erdogan sent forces to help the government in Tripoli and drove Haftar back. So he succeeded there against the Russians. And to some degree in Idlib, he has succeeded, because the Syrian army was in the process of reconquering Idlib, and it's had to stop. I mean, the arrival of the Turkish forces did not stop the last Syrian offensive, but they prevented it from going even further. So perhaps Erdogan thinks that this is working, and that the Russians, he has a sense that the Russians at the last minute will always strike a deal, will always try to cool things down, will always back off, which I think is more or less true, in fact. and that therefore, he can afford to push. That is a possibility also. But we're speculating.
But what would be the end game here with Nagorno-Karabakh? Because Erdogan was today talking about this is occupied Armenian land. This is land that belongs to Azerbaijan. Armenians are occupying it. So he can't seriously be thinking in terms of Armenians just simply giving it up and saying, we're going to move out and here you can have all this land back. That's not realistic, and that's not going to happen. So what can Erdogan hope to get out of this?
Again, you'd have to ask him.
But I think it's interesting, yep. George, it's a very interesting question, and I think the answer will surprise and disappoint simultaneously, is because I don't think Erdogan really knows. I think he's playing it as every step goes along. That says that is a duplication of what he's doing in Libya. It's a duplication of what he's doing in Syria. He does it on a step-by-step. He's not playing chess here. He's playing checkers, because I think
you push a little bit, you see where it goes. And, certainly if you study the history of war, you might imagine that a decision as important as war would be preceded by a long discussion of pros and cons and determining a clear objective in a Clausewitzian sense of war being a pursuit of politics by other means. But when you study history of war, you find that politicians actually don't do that. It's almost like the more important the matter, the less they think about it. Right. And war after war has been caused by people stumbling into it by not really, just doing this incrementalism, by not really having a clear objective or having a multiplicity of contradictory objectives. This is the way politicians work, and they shouldn't with something as important as war, where you should, if you want it to work in the eyes of strategists, you should have a clear objective. Right,
but in this case,
force is used towards a clear objective, but it doesn't happen.
But in this case, I think the Russians are in a strong position when it comes to Armenia. I mean, I just don't think that Turkey can seriously wage any kind of a conflict if the Russians get seriously involved. I think it's a little different in Syria because there's Russia's involvement in Syria is still limited. I think in this case, Russia's involvement would not be limited. I mean, they just wouldn't tolerate any kind of defeat of Armenia by Turkey. I think Russia would definitely get seriously involved in such circumstances.
But don't you think, to both of you, I think this is just Erdogan's brinksmanship. It's possible we get to a fevered pitch like we have with the shooting down, and this is Armenian reporting, okay? I haven't confirmed it independently. This is what they're claiming, their media. But it seems to me that he gets it to a boiling pitch, and then he comes out and he settles everything, meaning we go back to the beginning. He got his moment in the sun, his hardcore followers in Turkey. What a peacemaker he is. I'm sorry. I've been watching this conflict for decades, and this is what it's about. It's bravado a great deal of the time for consumption for your constituents, okay? And because Erdogan, does he want a full-scale war with Russia? Obviously not, okay? But he can play the crowd until it gets to that point and then step back. I think that's a reasonable assessment.
Yeah, it's sort of a Donald Trump method of international politics, if you want to say, blow hard and then back down at the last moment. He probably hasn't thought it through very hard. The problem is, though, that if the Azerbaijani forces were to be very successful, and were to then push into Nagorno-Karabakh itself, the result would probably be a bloodbath on a major scale, because the locals there are going to fight. I mean, it's their homes, it's their futures at stake. They're not going to go down, without defending each little village and each little town, and the place would have to be turned into rubble, one village after another, and it would be a humanitarian catastrophe. So that's not to say that in some theoretical scenario, the Azeri army could not manage it, though I don't think that they probably can. But theoretically, I suppose they could, but they couldn't manage it without a humanitarian catastrophe on an extremely large scale.
We're rapidly running out of time. It seems to me that everyone now is staring into the abyss, and we have to all keep our fingers crossed that people want to step back, because we know what ethnic cleansing looks like in our world today. Paul Robinson, thank you for joining us. Thank you, George. Thank you for being on the Gaggle here. If you like this, like, share, and subscribe, and there's much more ahead.